Welcome to the Law School Toolbox Podcast. Today, we're here with ex-BigLaw Recruiter Sadie Jones to talk about the basics of resumes and cover letters. Your Law School Toolbox host is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm here with my co-host, Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Career Conference. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. And if you enjoy the show, please leave a review. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact forum on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Want some personalized help on your resume, cover letter, job search strategies, or interview prep? Visit our career-focused site at careerdicta.com, and we would be happy to help. Welcome back. Today, we're here with ex-BigLaw Recruiter Sadie Jones to talk about the basics of resumes and cover letters, something that I'm sure you have seen a lot of. Well, first question, how many resumes do you think you have reviewed in your entire life?
I have probably reviewed thousands of resumes, maybe 5,000 resumes.
Wow.
Throughout my career.
That's a lot.
Yes, I would look at multiple a day, every single day when I was working at law firms, between students and laterals, partners.
Okay, so you have a pretty good idea at this point of what a good and a bad resume look like.
I do, at least to myself.
Right. Well, other people listen to you, right?
Yes. Well, I would basically be the screener and sending things on to the partners and other attorneys. So. Okay. I was really the one deciding whether the resume looked worth passing along. Okay,
so you had the ability to say no if you got a resume and you're like, you know what, there are 3 typos in the first 2 lines. I don't think this is a great person to work for us.
Correct.
Did you have to justify that, or was it really just like yes or no?
Maybe at first. I think once the attorneys got to know me, they trusted my opinion. So there really wasn't much double checking what I thought. I think when I was first starting, maybe they would want to see that, my judgment matched their judgment.
Right. All right. Well, that's actually good to know, like that the recruiting person at this firm or wherever you're sending your resume may be the one who's really making the final decision about whether you're going to make the cut.
Correct. So I think that's really the person you want to be impressing.
Okay. So what makes a resume good versus one that's mediocre or really bad in general?
Well, I think, first of all, it should be easy to read. So it should have a clear idea of what your experience is and what your story is and where you went to school and all the jobs you've had. And I shouldn't be having to look for things or put anything together or trying to fill in holes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen sometimes where people leave the dates off of things and stuff like that, but I feel like that for me at least, that just raises red flags.
Correct. And if I saw a hole or some kind of time period that was missing and it wasn't explained, I would immediately think, something had happened or there was an issue there.
Right, where in reality the person may have just been dealing with a family situation or something. It's almost better to... Well, I guess that's one we should talk about later. That can be a tricky one. All right. So in general, though, we're looking for something that's clean, easy to read, obviously no typos.
Correct. And I really liked everything to line up. So, all the margins should be the same and where you're starting are bullets and things like that. So that's what I mean by definitely easy to read.
Yeah, that was one of my pet peeves, was when someone would left justify something and then right justify something. But then
drives me crazy.
Well, I don't mind that as long as both of the margins align and things are actually right aligned. But when someone tries to right align dates or something and they don't line up, oh my God, it drives me crazy.
Exactly. I mean, I think that a resume just formatting should always be checked by multiple people because someone's going to probably see that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's because I have a design background, but I'm like, don't you see that these margins don't line up?
I agree. That stuff would drive me crazy.
Yeah, and I think it's also something to keep in mind if you're dealing with a Word document and then you convert it to a PDF, which you should do. You want to make sure the PDF doesn't transfer over any weird formatting because, whatever you're presenting needs to be the one that lines up.
And my advice is always to convert it to a PDF and then print the PDF.
Yes, for sure. I agree. So I think, it's got to be clean. It's got to be technically accurate. And this is also really the opportunity to start telling your story. So, I mean, one of the things I often tell people when I look at their resumes is, you've got to sell yourself here. Like, you've got to put the pieces together for someone. And if you've got weird stuff, I mean, and this is also where the cover letter can come in. But if you've got weird stuff on your resume, I had a really weird resume. I had a lot of strange degrees. I had an architecture background. I had a programming background. I had a legal background, all this stuff. And so it was kind of on me to put this together in a way where someone thinks, oh yeah, that makes sense, versus like, what in the world did this person do?
Yeah, so I think in that case, I would want to categorize it right and make sure that things that go together should go together, and you're kind of telling the story of different skills you've learned and the path you took, and maybe it can become obvious even just like from looking at someone's resume why they went from one thing to the next thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And what their interests are. I also think, you put the resume together as you want to, and you don't have to put everything you've ever done on your resume. I think it's good to edit.
Yes, I think that's a key area that sometimes people get so obsessed with, like, oh, I have to put every job I've ever had. It's like, really? Do they care that I was a lifeguard when I was 16? Probably not.
Absolutely. And I see so much of that, and I think all that says to me is that person doesn't feel like they have enough for their resume.
Right.
And they're trying to fill things in. And rather than do that, I would say maybe add some more substance to certain jobs you have had.
Yeah, I think people want to take away, like, what did you really do here? How does that apply here? And sometimes people wonder, like, oh, well, should I put jobs that maybe aren't super prestigious on there? And I think there's an argument in certain cases, yes. If you worked your way through college working as a waitress or a barista or whatever it was, presumably you learned some useful skills there. I used to have a boss who would only hire people who had been a wait staff, because he thought it was a great training ground for dealing with people, dealing with stress, multitasking, all these things. So I don't think you have to leave off stuff that, isn't super prestigious, but it needs to be explained in a way that makes it sound like, you're doing something that's useful here.
I agree. And in that case, I would say I've seen a lot of resumes where you write, I worked 30 hours a week throughout college or law school or whatnot. And I think that says a lot. So I would put details where you think that they can help you.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to put, worked at McDonald's. It's like, I was a shift leader at McDonald's and I worked 30 hours a week working my way through school, and I was promoted 3 times, and, whatever it is. Because then that shows, like, hey, this is a person who's a hustler. They went out there and they got this job and they supported themselves. And yeah, it's not a glamorous job, but they're going to do the work when you need them to do the work. So it's not that you have to leave this stuff off. It's just, it needs to be sort of framed in a way that makes it clear how it's relevant.
I mean, I think your resume is your way to tell your story and put your best foot forward and kind of show where you excel. I would also say, when I say edit, make sure you're not leaving anything off that's important. Because we would see sometimes like a transcript from another school, but that school not listed on the resume. And that is a huge red flag. So you should make sure you're not leaving anything off that's relevant.
Right. And I transferred schools after my first year of college, and I always put my first school on my resume, but I didn't go into a lot of detail. It was really just there to be like, hey, I went to this school for a year, whatever.
Exactly. Just so no one thinks you're being deceptive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So when they get the transcript, they're like, wait, you were at Rice? What? That's not it anywhere.
Exactly. But you wouldn't believe how many of those resumes I've seen.
Yeah, it's interesting. Or people, do you ever see ones of people who try to hide that they transferred law schools?
I don't know that they were consciously trying to hide it. And usually someone's transferred because they did really good at, let's say, a lower ranked law school and transferred to a better law school. And I think in their mind, they should just highlight the better law school. So I don't think they're necessarily doing it on purpose, but I've seen that quite a bit. And I would say to the student, you really need to make sure all the schools you've attended are on here. And they would say they just didn't realize. So My advice to everyone right now is make sure any school you attended is on there.
Right. What do you think about like undergraduate study abroad? I feel like that should at least be mentioned as well.
I would mention it, but very briefly. I wouldn't let it take up too much space on your resume, but I think it's relevant. And I think you could mention what type of course you did if it's relevant, or if you became like fluent in a language, or it's relevant to you want to work in international law or something like that.
Yeah. I think for me, I just sort of listed it in case, because I think I've had to send that transcript in places.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Especially if, it's an accredited school and you did get credit for the work you did.
Yeah, I mean, it's unlikely anyone's going to ding you for studying abroad, so you may as well just go ahead and put it on there.
Correct. I think it's just something you kind of make a little note of.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, isn't that interesting? It also gives people something to talk about in the interview when you're running out of material. Like, oh, how did you like studying abroad in Madrid? What did you do? Do you speak Spanish?
I do think that's one of the biggest advantages to a resume, too, is just giving, some information to discuss in an interview.
Right. I think that's absolutely key. I mean, sometimes people think it's just sort of an objective list of everything they've ever done, but really you're planting seeds of things that you would like to talk about or that you don't mind talking about or that you're comfortable talking about, so that, hopefully you get those questions instead of what happened in Civ Pro, 1L year. You want to have someone who's more like, oh, I was in the same organization in law school. Tell me what it's like these days. And then you have a connection. So, all right, let's dive into some specific questions that we often get about resumes. This is probably number one, honestly. I'm not really sure why, but how long should the resume be? Is 1 page a requirement, or are there situations where longer is okay?
So my advice is you should aim to have it be 1 page.
Right.
Most people who are in this position, and I think we're talking about entry-level lawyers or law students, don't have that much experience. And I think if you inflate it maybe doesn't say something good about you. That you are trying to make a much longer resume out of, kind of a short period of time. My exceptions would be if you do have, let's say, a lot of technical experience, and, you're trying to be a patent prosecutor and you have engineering background and you've published a lot of papers and things like that. I think some of that could make it a little bit longer. So I think if you have something very specialized, maybe that's okay to go a little bit over. But overall, most people in this position should keep it to 1 page.
Yeah, I feel like almost every law student resume I see, I'm like, this could be 1 page, really?
Yeah. And it just doesn't look good.
No, because you end up using filler. The problem is if you go over 1 page, you can't really do a page and a half. I mean, it kind of needs to be, I guess a little different if you're doing a list of publications or something like that. But typically I would say if you go into 2 pages, it needs to be 2 pages.
And I think if it's a little bit over 1 and there's kind of nothing you want to take out, I'm okay with a little bit of formatting magic to make certain things a little bit smaller. I've done that on my own resume. So I'm okay as long as it's readable. But I think the rule of thumb is 1 page.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the reality is if you go from, say, a 1-inch margin all around to 0.75-inch margin, or even, I think in the end I went down to a 1/2-inch margin on the left and right. And it looks a little weird, but you can fit a lot more stuff on it.
I agree. I would go in that direction rather than make it longer.
Yeah, and you can almost always edit. And a lot of it could be formatting. If you've got bullet points, condense those into a paragraph. Okay, you just saved yourself 2 lines. Great, you can put a whole other job in 2 lines.
There's a way to cut down on the tasks that you've done at certain jobs. You use a lot of filler words, things like that. You can make those shorter.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's just formatting. Obviously you want to have enough white space on your resume that it's not totally cluttered, but at the same time, you can squeeze a lot of stuff in if your formatting is well done.
Absolutely, I agree.
All right, so here's another common one. Should your education go first or your work experience go first? And if you're not sure, how do you decide that?
So I think this changes over time and over your career, but pretty much everyone in this situation should have their education first. We're talking about entry-level legal job, and so what you want to highlight is the work you're doing in law school first.
Right.
And I think as you get more experienced, and when I would see lateral resumes, their work experience would move up. So that would be my rule for, an entry-level summer associate position.
I think that's totally right. And then, throughout your career, it probably starts to depend too on how prestigious your law school was, how well you did there. Always you want to be thinking about what do you want to highlight here? What's the first thing you want them to see when they see this resume? You're like, oh, you're top of your class at Harvard. Okay,
Absolutely. And then I think, if you get a job at a really prestigious firm or you have a really prestigious clerkship, maybe that will become more important. So I think your resume is sort of a living thing that changes over time.
Oh, for sure. And how can people handle kind of unrelated, like non-legal work experience, especially these people I'm thinking of who might be a little bit older, maybe they've even had a whole prior career, if you had been, say, doing marketing, or say you were working in a lab, I mean, your resume for getting that next job in that field is going to look really different than your legal resume, right?
Well, I would say don't run away from the other experience you've had. I don't think it necessarily says, oh, I didn't have legal experience. I think it says I have good experience at something else. I think you should think about what you're highlighting at those jobs and how those tasks relate to what it would be like to be a lawyer. Mm-hmm. So if you would be managing other people, or keeping things organized,
any sort of writing,
things like that,
communicating,
exactly. Research, you work well with a team, all of those kind of things. So I think you want to take what you can out of your previous experience and relate it to what you're going to be doing now. I also think that excelling in anything, whether it was a former career or, just summer positions or internships or things like that, always, are positive.
Yeah, and I saw this discussion recently regarding specifically military service, and one of the points that someone was making, which I thought was a really good point, was you definitely want to own this and you want to think about how it applies, but you have to be careful to explain to, in this case, a civilian, like what you're talking about. So if you say like, oh, I had a platoon of da-da-da, and like throw in a bunch of lingo, people are going to be like, what is that? So you need, anytime that it's outside of the legal realm, I think you need to be really clear and probably have some people who are not experts in the field you used to work in really look at this and say like, oh yeah, I understand what you're saying here, versus, I was a like MW3 blah, blah, blah. You're like, what are you talking about?
I agree. And I like that idea of having other people read it. And I think even having non-lawyers read things that might sound legal to make sure that they make sense to anyone, because, you might be having your resume looked at by a lawyer who's not in that area. So I think you really want it to be easy to read and understand. I think military service is great. I think highlighting anything that you did that's sort of different is a positive at law firms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they're looking for someone, a little more interesting than just like straight out of undergrad. Not, of course, you can get a job at a law firm if you go straight through, but there's always, on the back of your mind, you're sort of thinking like, wow, it would be nice to have someone who's a little different here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there still are lots of law students that go straight through, but more and more they're giving credit to people who have prior work experience.
Right. And what about those people who go straight through? I mean, what are they supposed to put in their work experience if they don't really have very much?
I think you really have to kind of dig deep and think about, what you've done, what accomplishments you've had, but you also don't want to overplay it. Right. Because I think that sends the wrong tone. So I think you want to make it clear that, you don't have a ton of work experience, but here are things you've done that you've excelled at and that you're eager, to excel at this.
Right. And you can also include volunteer work or public service. You can, I'm not saying
summer
you should.
Jobs.
Yeah.
Any awards you've had undergrad, anything like that.
Obviously, you can't really make like, oh, I was on the student government into a real job, but you can put that, you can go into some detail about what you did there if you had a real solid position. I mean, you got to work with what you have.
Exactly. I think there's a lot of creative ways to, sell yourself.
Yeah, and a lot of it's in the framing. I mean, I've helped various people with their resumes. Like, my sister at one point followed fish around the country one summer. And when she applied to grad school, that summer became tour of the national parks and monuments of the U.S.
Exactly. And I'm sure she did see lots of national parks.
It was absolutely true. She's like, yep, we did camp there a lot. We tried to go anytime we were in the area. I'm like, we don't need to mention it was fish tour.
Well, that's why I think it's good to go through your story with somebody else.
Think about how you can frame it. It's all about the framing.
Yeah.
If you're going to be a lawyer, you got to learn how to frame things, and this is a great way to start.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, here's a question that actually generated a lot of debate recently on Twitter. What do you think about the interest section, pro or con?
I used to actually not have an interest section on my own resume, and I thought that they were kind of silly.
I think it's weird. I'd never seen them until I saw legal resumes.
Yeah, I think that's what happened. Once I started working as a recruiter at law firms, I realized that they actually are really useful just because it gives you a little more sense of the person and it gives you things to talk about in an interview. So I always say now that you should have an interest section.
I agree. I think they're useful. I think some people have concerns about like implicit bias and that kind of thing, but to me it feels like almost an ability to control the narrative a little bit more. What kind of stuff should people put on them or not put on them, do you think?
So I think it's fine to have sort of general, things you're interested in, but I always like to get a little bit more specific under the general. So for example, if you like to cook, I would say, put a specific kind of food or
and
somewhere you've gone, like you've taken cooking lessons.
If you say that, please be prepared to talk about it. Because I had some guy once, this poor guy, like this interview was going, I was the interviewer and it was just going nowhere. And so I'm trying to kill some time. And I'm like, oh, I see on your resume that you're really interested in baking. That's great. Like, what do you like to bake? And he looks at me and says, well, I guess that's really more aspirational. I mean, I like to watch cooking shows. And I'm like, come on, dude. Like, is there more of a softball? What do you like to bake? Just make something up.
Yeah, I mean, I also think in that case, he could have put something like that he's really interested in cooking competitions.
Yeah, exactly. I don't care what it is.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I had a friend in law school who put cheese on her resume, but she was legitimately like very, very into cheese. She had done classes, she had like done all the stuff. And she said literally every single person talked to her about cheese, but she would rather talk about that than con law. So she was happy.
And I think that's great. I actually think sort of the quirky things, that's what, us behind the scenes like to talk about. And I'll point it out to an attorney. Like, do you see that this person says, they recorded like a pop song in Korea once?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Which had come up with somebody. Yeah, and it was true. And, I think stuff like that. I also think a lot of people maybe think that their interests aren't that great, so they think it's going to be boring. But I think anything that gives a little bit of flavor to who you are, and sit down and think about what your interests actually are.
Right, and if somebody likes to read, it's like, okay, reading might be a boring interest, but say that you're really into reading historical biographies. That's automatically more interesting. Put that on there.
So I think, take the like larger topic or subject matter and then try to break it down and say to yourself, wait, what about this do I really, like to do?
Right.
And then put that specific thing. And, I would say maybe have 2 to 5 interests.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be like everything you've ever thought about doing.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, travel, like instead of just travel, you're like, well, where have you traveled? So you could list out the countries or the cities or whatever. This is all just to give flavor to you as a person. Okay.
Yeah, and you're making the job easier for the person who has to sit across from you and think of something to say.
Exactly, because most of those people are not really trained to do interviews.
Exactly. I wasn't going to say that, but yeah.
So how about GPA, class rank, things like this? Like, A, are you expected to put this? I mean, I know the school I was at actually wouldn't allow us to put it. And how about grades for like very specific classes if you did well in them?
So you're not expected to. I do think if you excelled at something, you should put it on, except in the case, like you said, I mean, you shouldn't do anything that's against the rules of the school or the honor code or anything like that. But I do think that if you have an excellent GPA, or if your school does class rank, or if you got, the highest grade in the class on something, or you won any kind of award or anything like that, I think all of that is great. I think that, if you don't have anything to highlight, you don't have anything to highlight. That's okay. You don't have to put it on. Yeah, I mean, I think you're not going to, put that you got a B and a C in this class.
Yeah, you probably want to do well. I mean, again, like you're not required to put your class rank on there. So if you're in the bottom quarter of your class, like maybe you leave that off and they can look at your transcript and figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to come out eventually, but your resume is your chance to highlight, your best stuff. So that's where I would put it if you can. So I don't think it's showing off or anything like that.
No, you should show off it's a resume.
Yeah, exactly. But I've had law students say to me that they don't want to brag.
No, if there's ever a time in your life to brag and you have things to brag about, this is the time.
I couldn't agree more.
So, get over your false modesty about getting an A+ in, whatever class it was, and just put the A+ on there.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on and talk a little bit about cover letters. So, do people really need a cover letter?
So I'll tell you, personally, I hate writing cover letters. I don't think
doesn't?
anyone likes writing cover letters, and I think we all think of a million reasons why we don't have to write one. But I think you should write one. So I think everyone just needs to get rid of the fact that they don't want to do it and just do it. I think it's fine to have sort of a general one where you change some things. But I think you want to make sure it's not the exact same cover letter, because then you're likely to make mistakes like not change the name of the firm, which I saw very often.
Right, so we're talking like a mail merge situation where you put the wrong envelope.
Don't ever do that. And I would see that probably on average a couple times a week. Either someone's name is spelled wrong, it's the wrong name, it's the wrong firm, it's the firm that was before the merger, all sorts of things like that. So I think you want to read it over carefully. You want to make some changes. You want to make some reference to something specific at that firm or the practice group you're interested in or whatnot. But yeah, I think a cover letter is necessary, whether or not the person's going to read it. Like, you're expected to have one.
Yeah, and some people will read it. So, it needs to basically tell your story as well. Like, hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm applying for. This is, how I think I can help. You probably don't want to pretend that you're personally going to, change the entire focus or, success of the firm. You've got to pay some attention to tone, be a little bit humble, that kind of thing. Well, here's a practical question. If I'm emailing my application, where does the cover letter go?
So I actually think it could be an attachment or it could be in the email. Mm-hmm. Usually, if you're sending in an application, though, you're sending it into like the online system of the firm. So there's usually a place where you upload all your documents. I know that as a recruiter, I prefer that everybody do it that way. So I think some people think that writing the person directly is going to get to them more. It's actually more work for the person because then your documents don't get uploaded. So usually I just would direct people to our firm website. Also, a lot of states have laws where, every applicant has to be counted. So what I would say is usually you're not in a situation where it's going to even be in an email. Use the online system, or, you can send in a paper copy, but the best thing to do is just apply through the website.
I definitely agree. Anytime someone wants to apply for our job outside of that, I just send them the link and I'm like, could you please use this link to apply? Because there's a whole set of stuff that happens on the back end that doesn't happen if I just get an email.
And it's like someone doesn't have to manually put anything in.
Yeah, like if somebody makes it a hassle for me to look at their stuff, I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to look at it.
Yeah, I agree. So that's my advice on that.
How are you supposed to find out who to address this to, and what do you do if you can't find a person?
So I would say in most cases, a hiring partner or recruiting manager or even the head of the office is listed on the website.
Right.
I almost can't think of a situation where it wouldn't be. If it really wasn't, you didn't see anywhere where anyone was listed, I think it's okay to say, dear hiring manager or dear hiring partner.
Yeah, you could probably even call, if it's an organization that has a main phone number, just call the receptionist and be like, hi, I'd like to apply for a job. Who should I direct that towards?
I would say that what it showed me was that you were willing to put in the work to figure out who you even had to address it to. And that you spelled their name correctly.
Yes.
That says everything. It's not like the hiring partner isn't reading your application, most likely. It's somebody else. But the fact that I would make sure, they got the person right and they looked it up and this wasn't someone who was hiring partner 5 years ago.
Yeah, it just
all this stuff is also listed on NALP.
Right, that's what I was going to say.
It all has to be in there. So that's a great resource.
Yeah, and the NALP directory is a great place to find out a lot of this stuff. All right, Final question on cover letters. What if I have a contact at the organization? Can I name drop that in the cover letter, and is that going to help at all?
So I feel like if you have a contact that you know well enough, then you should be applying to them.
Right. So you actually send them your materials and they pass it along.
I don't really like the idea that if you didn't know the person well enough that you didn't feel comfortable doing that, or, you talked to them first and they put in a good word for you, but then you sent your materials, that's fine too. I feel like there shouldn't be a situation where you're mentioning it like to the hiring manager and that person hasn't heard of you outside of that. That kind of says it's not really a good contact.
Yeah, I guess the one exception I'm thinking of personally is when I was applying for clerkships. One of the people I'd worked with as a summer, one of the partners encouraged me to apply to certain friends of his. And in that letter, I mean, clerkships are also a little different because it's more personal, but I did say, hey, so-and-so that I worked with this summer suggested that I apply to you because he had great things to say. But that's a little different than like, hey, I played golf with like Bob Jones, give me a job.
Yeah, I think that tone sounds fine. That's more what I was thinking. Like, I know this big time partner. I'm sure you'll be impressed with that.
Yeah.
No one wants to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, if you really have a connection, I think you're right. You should use them a little bit more directly and have them actually make the call for you or pass along your materials.
I also think of as a junior person, like you knew someone who some were there last summer. That's a great thing to say. They had a great experience. They just finished. I think that makes sense. I go to the same law school.
You talk to them. They really highly recommended the firm, but then you're really complimenting the firm. You're not just complimenting yourself.
Exactly.
And again, like drop something specific. Tone. I know they had a great experience working with partner X. They really enjoyed their work on case Y. It looks like
you really knew.
Like you're going to look at that. Exactly. All right, so let's wrap up with just a few quick miscellaneous things. When do people need to send a transcript, and does that have to be an official transcript, or is some copy okay?
So I would send a transcript when you send in your application. If you don't do that, all it creates is another step for that person to have to ask you for it, because there's no way they don't want to see your transcript.
Right, and it's probably going to be in their system, right, when you upload stuff.
Exactly. So I think you should never submit an application without a transcript. And that actually goes straight through being a lateral. We always ask for transcripts. It makes it easier to just do it right off the bat. It doesn't need to be an official transcript. It can be an unofficial transcript.
As long as you don't change the grades.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I actually had an experience where that happened. And we obviously, in the end, when we make the offer or they're coming, we order an official transcript and we compare it. And that is like worst case scenario, really serious ethical issue. So obviously don't change the grades. And I think there's always a way to kind of print out an unofficial one. That looks better than just writing like a list of your classes and grades. I don't really like how that looks either.
Yeah, that doesn't look official at all. If it's unofficial, it should still look pretty official.
Yeah, so I think that's fine. You don't need to be ordering like a bunch of official copies.
Yeah. And what about writing samples? I mean, is that something people should typically expect to submit initially or later in the process, or maybe even not at all?
I wouldn't submit it initially. I would probably ask them if they want a writing sample or offer it later. I feel like it's a lot of paper, and most likely we're not reading it unless you get further in the process anyway. And people might ask you for one. But I think initially cover letter, resume, and transcript is all you need.
Perfect. Keep it simple.
Yep.
All right. And my final question, is it ever okay to follow up if you just didn't get a response, or do you just kind of have to let it go if they're completely ignoring you?
I think it's okay to follow up once a reasonable amount of time has gone by.
Not like 2 days.
Yeah, you don't want to be bugging people. Things take time. Most likely, like if you're going through the process and, if you've gotten through the initial especially, they'll give you like information on a timeline. I also think if you talk to the person, it's fine to say, what's your timeline? If it's been 2 or 3 weeks and you haven't heard anything, I think that's fine to check in casually. You should never not hear back from someone that, says something bad on their end.
Right.
So I would say it's fine. I just think, be careful that you're not being any kind of a pest in a situation where they are dealing with hundreds of candidates.
Yeah. You personally are not probably their very highest priority that day.
Exactly.
And there's a system. There's a process.
Exactly. And, sometimes the process gets broken or dropped, or it's always good to reiterate how interested you are. I think, if you really are and this is your top choice, that's great. But do it once.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
If you'd like personal help on your resume and cover letter or on interviewing or job search strategy, visit careerdicta.com and we'd be happy to help. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox Podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening. We'll talk soon, and good luck with your job hunt.